good time, I say good afternoon. Good afternoon. Oh, thank you, yeah. So we're winding up a wonderful day. I should remind you to please give us your evaluations. Emily will be glad to take them afterwards. And there was one other thing I was supposed to tell you, but I can't remember, so that's okay. Oh yeah, right. We always have a little reception afterwards, and we will, so you can debrief over a glass of wine or whatever you would like outside afterwards. But now, our final lecture of the day will take us back to the terrorist attacks in Paris in January of this year. Teresa Grettano of our English department will parse for us the responses. Yeah, thanks. Responses to the murderous attacks on the satiric newspaper, Charlie Hebdo, followed on the same day by an attack on a kosher supermarket. Teresa will analyze the expressions of solidarity and speculate on more effective approaches to reconciliation that might have been adopted. This terrorism is become a regular part of our lives, and so we need to think more constructively about how to behave under those circumstances. An assistant professor of English and theater, Teresa will lead us to a deeper understanding of terrorism and our responses to it. Please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, hello. Thank you all for being here. The mic's okay, everything, you can see me, all right, over the podium. All right, like Sandra said, we're going to talk about the Charlie Hebdo attacks as a case study more so than anything else, about to look at how we have been reacting to terrorism, the kinds of language that we've adopted to discuss it. I'll probably it'll be less of me analyzing stuff for you and more of me kind of giving you things to think about. And then hopefully the second half of this, we can talk about your reactions to some of the theories that I'm going to be talking about, and possibly your reactions to some of the images that I'll show and to the attacks themselves or other attacks like them. So start with a quick overview for those of you that might not know the details. January 7th of this year, the offices of the satirical newspaper Charlie Hebdo were attacked in Paris just before lunchtime. Armed gunmen, brothers claiming affiliation with Al-Qaeda's Yemen branch, entered the offices and opened fire, killing 11 people and injuring 11 people in the building. Of those dead were Charlie Hebdo's editor-in-chief, Stéphane Charbonnet, and the beloved cartoonist Jean Cabot, as well as other cartoonists, journalists, staff members, security personnel. The gunmen killed a French police officer, Ahmed Marabet, when they fled the scene of the attack, and we'll talk later about him. Related attacks occurred after, resulting in 5 more people dead and 11 more injured, and by the end of the manhunt and the standoff of that day, both gunmen and the accomplice were killed by the French police. So it's just an overview of the details. In the aftermath, Suis-Je Charlie was the solidarity call after. It became a slogan, was on signs, it was all over the internet, social media. In response, I Am Charlie in French erupted as a rallying cry against terrorism and in solidarity with Charlie Hebdo, the French people, and journalists everywhere. It was a slogan that worked to support freedom of speech and expression, freedom of the press, freedom of everyday people to live their lives without fear of terrorism or random acts of violence. And Suis-Je Charlie is the slogan for the title of my talk. I flipped it. Instead of I am Charlie, am I Charlie? So we'll be questioning whether or not we should align in this type of response to terrorism. The social media platform Twitter recorded 5 million tweets in France alone that used the hashtag to join the global response. The Telegraph reported that the hashtag had been tweeted at a rate of 6,500 times a minute at its height following Paris massacre, and featured a 3.4 million tweets in just 24 hours. lots and lots of tweets. People were speculating that this was the most popular hashtag in Twitter history, and it wasn't. The World Cup had like 10 times as many. But in terms of a response to a political event, it kind of matched the response to the Ferguson riots in the United States. It was on that same kind of level of participation, but still, it's a lot. 3.4 million tweets in just 24 hours is a lot. 5 million in France alone, that's a lot of people using the same slogan, tying their conversations together in that way, because that's what the hashtag function does on Twitter. It links conversations, so you can see threads of people talking about the same thing. Cartoonists particularly took to their streets, their newspapers, social media accounts, and online venues to offer solidarity with Charlie Hebdo and to stand for freedom of expression. I'm only going to include a few here. There were hundreds of them. Some of them were better than others. Some of them were more appropriate than others, and we'll talk about what's appropriate or what I would consider appropriate and what might not be appropriate. But I'm going to show you just a few here. Jean Julien was one of the first, and this was one of the more popular ones. If a lot of people were using this cartoon as their social media profile picture, so we saw this a lot on that day. This one I particularly like because of the, and you can't really see it on the screen, the hands are all different colors, so the diversity of unity, of solidarity going against terrorism. And this one was my favorite when it came out, and it was first wrongfully attributed to the guerrilla graffiti artist Banksy. I don't know if any of you know about him, or her. We don't know who that is. But it was then rightfully attributed to Lucille Clark. And this one, again, break one, thousands will rise. This was a sign of solidarity with not just the journalists, although for a lot of the artists it was. It was their freedom of expression that they were also, standing up for. And again, there are hundreds of these. I encourage you to take a look online after and look at them. Like, some of them are really beautiful and poignant. Some of them, not so much, but we'll see. All right, so what am I doing here? I am here as a representative of the academic discipline of rhetoric. And rhetoric kind of floats among academic disciplines. Here I am housed in the Department of English and Theater. That doesn't necessarily mean that I teach English or theater. I don't teach literature. I don't teach acting. I do teach writing and rhetoric. And when I tell people that I teach rhetoric or that I study rhetoric, they generally wince. Because rhetoric has got a pretty bad reputation in terms of the name of it alone. But I'll talk about that in a minute. My being in rhetoric means that my mind is always analyzing language. I'm always analyzing speech acts. Always analyzing language as action. So what is this language doing? How is it working? And so as all of this was happening with the Charlie Hebdo attacks in January, I'm following the news and I'm looking at what people are doing and I'm trying to get information, but at the same time, I'm being critical of how our media and how we personally are responding to these things. My mind is trained to analyze things as they're happening. So I went into rhetorical analysis mode. And again, rhetoric has a bad reputation. My father used to tell people when I was finishing my Ph.D. that I was getting a Ph.D. in the art of BSing, and that if this teaching thing didn't work, I could always sell cars or run for office. Rhetoric generally is understood as something that is empty language or language that's used to deceive, language that's used in place of any kind of real ideas. But the academic study of rhetoric doesn't, we don't think that's what we study. Rhetoric as an academic study acknowledges those bad things that we're known for, but has for millennia worked to analyze how human beings communicate, how we use language to live together, how language constructs and influences our beliefs, our knowledge, our understandings of who we are, and what the world is, really. We generally ask these questions to start with. These are basic rhetorical questions, not questions that you're not supposed to answer, rhetorical questions, but questions that rhetoricians would ask. Whenever something happens, communication event or a language act, we would ask, what's the purpose? All right, what are you or someone else, if you're analyzing somebody else's language, trying to accomplish with this language act? Why are you speaking or writing? What's the point or what's the end game, right? Second, who's the audience? In other words, who are you trying to accomplish this thing with? Why would you want to with this group of people? And then analyzing motive or motivation is really big in rhetoric. Why would you want to? It's a big deal. And then asking what's the most effective or appropriate way to fulfill that purpose with that audience. Or if you're analyzing somebody else's language, how effective was the choices that that person made in terms of how they chose to deliver their message. So on January 7th, as I'm processing and mourning the Charlie Hebdo attacks and the people who were lost, on a personal and human level, I'm also trying to analyze the discursive or the linguistic aspects of it, because that's what I do. Now, the most common definitions of the academic study of rhetoric come from ancient Greece and Rome. A lot of you will be familiar with these definitions. Aristotle's, the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. The available means of persuasion is generally the given definition of rhetoric. Quintilian's is also pretty popular. A good man or a good person speaking well, that's what a rhetorician is. But again, in the 20th and the 21st century, contemporary understandings of rhetoric have developed much further than these two. For us now, rhetoric is always political. It's always about people trying to live together in a community. And that's always political. My research and my teaching is mostly influenced by a 20th century rhetorical theorist named Kenneth Burke, and we're going to talk a little bit about his theories. Burke defines rhetoric, at least in one iteration of it, and he's got a lot of articulations of basically the same theory, but one of the definitions is that rhetoric is a symbolic means of introducing cooperation in beings that by nature respond to symbols. So Burke believes that human beings, by our nature, respond to symbols, that we're symbol-making, symbol-using animals, and that's one of the things that separates us from other animals on the planet. And that we use these symbols to induce cooperation. Let's see, where am I? Inducing cooperation, okay, is the key to rhetoric, both so that we can understand how this is done by others and also how we can understand how we can do this ourselves better. So Burke's looking at on both angles as well. Burke believed that human beings are connected in our humanness. He would never use the word soul, but a lot of his theory kind of brings that about, but that we're connected in our being human, but we're separated from each other through our bodies, and that we use language or symbols continually to try to bridge that separation. That's the way that we bridge the separation of our bodies. And that's the function of rhetoric for Burke. He calls the process by which we work through, the process by which we try to bridge the separation, identification or consubstantiation. And consubstantiation is a very purposeful word for Burke. It does have religious meanings, and he's chosen this on purpose, but again, he would never say so in that way. But consubstantiation or identification. What he says is identities are constructed through persuasion that facilitates individuals to identify relations between themselves and others. In effect, understanding themselves in relation to others. The goal for Burke is to use language to motivate attitudes or behaviors that will allow individuals to relate to each other on an emotional level. So again, we're always using language to connect, right, to connect with other human beings. That's the purpose for Burke. And Burke's theory of identification is really what hit me with the Suis-Je Charlie response to the Charlie Hebdo attacks. And this is his theory of identification. I'm going to read through it slowly, and then we can talk about it. It's a little, the way that he writes is very difficult. One of my professors when I was in grad school refused to teach Kenneth Burke because she said she would have to have students read all of his work, and I don't know how many books he's written, before we can even start talking about it. So we just never read it with her. All right, so theory of identification. A is not identical with his colleague B, but insofar as their interests are joined, A is identified with B, or he may identify himself with B, even when their interests are not joined, if he assumes that they are or is persuaded to believe so. Here are ambiguities of substance. In being identified with B, A is substantially one with a person other than himself. Yet at the same time, he remains unique, an individual locus of motives. Thus, he is both joined and separate, at once a distinct substance and consubstantial with the other. Okay. Yep, it's a complicated process, but it is, pretty straightforward. Again, we identify ourselves with another if we believe that we have shared interests or beliefs, or if we're made to believe that that's the case, right? All right, through this discursive process, the tension between identity, right, who I am personally as a person separate, and subjectivity, who I am in the world, the tension between the individual and the shared or the communal, the personal and the public, is both highlighted and diminished. Identification unifies individuals under similar subject positions, right? So it makes us, even though we might have differences, it finds what's common and pulls us together. Krista Radcliffe, who's another rhetorical theorist, explains it as identification bridges differences and communicates common ground for persuasion and political action. So that's one of the lenses through which I saw the Charlie Hebdo response. I am Charlie. So if you think about identification, and A is not identical with B, but he might identify with B if their interests are common. Adopting the phrase, I am Charlie, we were taking on an identity, really becoming Charlie Hebdo, or what Charlie Hebdo stood for. And that gave me pause while I was, processing all of this, and we could talk about why in a second. Another rhetorical technique that's always with me is from Marxist literary critic Terry Eagleton. And his theory is called the fictionalized real. What he says is the fictionalized real are the myths that are developed by a community to hide the real that's too painful or dangerous to reveal, but which then become the real for the community. The community then acts on these myths. And if I could give you I'm going to give you a more detailed example, but a quick example might be in the United States, our myth of the founding of this country. How a lot of what happened to the indigenous population here gets erased from our common memory or from our cultural memory. We've created this other story, which in part is part of the story or might be partly true, but it kind of overtakes the rest of the story as the only reality. All right, my colleague, Shelley DeBlazes, who teaches in New Mexico, and I wrote an article for an edited collection called Activism and Rhetoric. And in that chapter, we explained the fictionalized real in detail. I'm going to quote from it. It says, once deployed into discourse, these stories, which are always rhetorical constructs, right? It's always language that we're dealing with, not so much the material or reality. We're dealing with language right now, are able to become material conditions of the community's history and present, regardless of their unreal or possibly false and constructed origins. In effect, some of these stories become mythologized and operate as the real, both in the way the community members envision their reality and in the way they practice their reality. So both in what they believe and what they understand, and also how they act. People in positions of power utilize these myths strategically for productive ends. These rhetorical acts compound and accelerate, often morphing into something that started out being purely linguistic or semiotic into something that's material and immediate. So because these stories have so much power, a lot of the times they become the reality that we understand, and then they also have consequences for the material. A lot of what our material reality, possibly our laws, which is something that we might talk about a little bit later, is based on these stories, which may or may not be the whole story or may not be true. So an example that we used is the United We Stand slogan that came up after 9/11. It comes up after just about everything. United We Stand in the United States, and how that works both rhetorically and materially. The slogan invades the consciousness and the corporality of the U.S. populace, maneuvering citizens into thinking the U.S. is a united nation at the same time as it mobilizes us to unite. And in particular, if you think about that slogan, United We Stand, and how it functioned for us after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Again, it made us believe that we were united, and it motivated us to unite. But thinking about it in terms of the fictionalized real, there were people in the United States, both citizens and non-citizens, who were not invited to be part of that we. So how unified as a population were we? Or how does that United We Stand slogan kind of hide the part of the population that's not unified or that's not welcomed into that we part of United We Stand? So again, these are all the things that were going through my head as the Charlie Hebdo stuff is happening. The process of identification and developing a fictionalized real are complex, of course, mainly because humans are complex and our relationships are complex. But this complexity demands that we analyze how we are developing these identifications and for what purposes. Again, asking rhetorical questions, the question about purpose, audience, and style. And again, that's what we want, that's what I'd like for us to talk about today once I get through the theory. And this is part of the reason why I think it's important for us to think about these things. So we can better understand both what's being highlighted and what's being hidden by the language that we choose. Burke explains, to begin with identification is by the same token, though roundabout, to confront the implications of division. So identifying is bringing us together, but at the same time, it's dividing us. And so in the end, men are brought to the most tragically ironic of all divisions or conflicts, wherein millions of cooperative acts go into the preparation of one single destructive act. We refer to the ultimate disease of cooperation as war, and that was Burke's big focus at the end of his career, was how all of these acts that are supposed to be bringing us together are actually bringing us to get together against another group of people and then splitting us further. Cultural critic Homi Bhabha makes the same point. He says, it's very important to understand that what the theory of identification allows us to understand is not just that we identify one-on-one or one on the other. It's not just who we identify with, but what you identify with in that subject. And that was what I was calling into question as the Charlie Hebdo stuff was happening. Saying, I am Charlie, what is it that we are aligning ourselves with? What is it that we're identifying with in this entity in itself, in the magazine, and we'll talk about what that is in a second, in the act that inspired the slogan? I mean, how many people knew what Charlie Hebdo was before January of this year? Lots of people, right. So what is it that we're actually identifying with or claiming as our shared identity? All right. And these are the questions. Again, rhetorical questions. What's the purpose? Who's the audience? Is this the most appropriate or effective style? These are the questions I was asking in response. Now, Charlie Hebdo, again, lots of people didn't know what it was before the attacks in January. It's got a turbulent history since its founding. It actually was founded in response to being banned for its depiction of the death of Charles de Gaulle in France. It was called something else before it was called Charlie Hebdo. It was part of another publication. And because it was because it made what was considered an offensive comic to depict the death of Charles de Gaulle, it was banned. So they had to reestablish the publication under a new name, and that was in 1970. And it was in circulation from 1970 till I think 1981-ish, and then it kind of died out because nobody was reading it. And then it came back in the early 90s. But it's always had a very turbulent history. It's known for skewering public figures on its covers and in its cartoons. Its cartoons is what made it famous. Past covers depicted Pope Benedict hugging a Vatican guard. It was a little bit more provocative than hugging, but Pope Benedict hugging a Vatican guard to criticize the Catholic Church's stance on homosexuality. Former French President Sarkozy has been depicted looking like a sick vampire. Kind of soulless too. And one cover showed an Orthodox Jew kissing a Nazi soldier. I mean, this is the kind of, again, it's a satire, but this is the kind of provocative work that this magazine has done throughout its history. For Charlie Hebdo, no one group or one person was safe from ridicule or criticism. But in the mid-2000s, it was about 2006, the magazine took on as its main focus religious fundamentalism and really went after Islam. And this is when the controversy really started up. If you all remember the controversy over the Danish cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, Charlie Hebdo took those cartoons and republished them after all of the uproar on purpose, knowing, again, you want to talk about asking questions about purpose. Why is it that they're doing this? Charlie Hebdo did not do things uncritically. The magazine staff knew exactly what they were doing, and they were doing it to make a point. Republished those cartoons of Muhammad and added their own, and then continually published cartoons of Muhammad. And the criticism is that, for Islam, that's a sin. You do not make depictions of the Prophet, but Charlie Hebdo not only republished the cartoons that caused the controversy, but then continued to publish cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad on its cover. It got sued. It won a lawsuit, which then was, celebrated as a victory for freedom of expression. The magazine staff continued to be defiant in the face of threats and criticism. The offices had been attacked before this January's attack. The editor-in-chief needed a personal bodyguard who was also killed during the attacks. This has been going on for a good almost 10 years. But they continued to be defiant in the face of threats and criticism for its disregard for the beliefs of others. In some, they knew they were incredibly offensive, and they continued to be so on purpose. Again, they felt as though they were serving political and public purposes. But if you think about it in terms of rhetoric and purpose, right, what are we identifying with when we declare, I am Charlie? What part of what the magazine and the staff were doing do we want to align ourselves with, and what part might be problematic for us? All right. Our wanting to express solidarity in the aftermath of terror, brutality, violence, it makes sense, right? Our being appalled by the terrorist attack makes sense. Our wanting to socially, publicly, have a shared response makes sense. That's what human beings do, especially when faced with sadness or with security fears. Okay, Pope Francis even declared that it's normal, and I'll talk about what he said in a second. For us to want to denounce violence and stand up for freedom makes sense. If we think about it in terms of solidarity, by definition, solidarity is the unity that produces or is based on a community of interests, objectives, and standards. And when I looked up this definition and saw produces or is based on, it returned me to Eagleton's Fictionalized Real, to that theory. Right? It's going to either be produced based on what's already existing, right? Things that we have in common that are already existing. Or it's going to make us have things in common, right? So it's either I identify with you because we have shared experiences or shared concerns, or I'm made to believe that we have shared concerns, and then I identify you. So it's the same kind of process going on here. And then a community of interests, objectives, and standards. What are the interests, objectives, and standards here? When we think about the Charlie Hebdo attacks and our response to it, what are the interests, objectives, and standards that we share? And again, for us, we want to denounce the views, we want to denounce violence, we want to celebrate freedom. Those are the things that we have in common. But to do so uncritically or in a way that ignores the contexts in which that violence has occurred, to ignore the ways our culture has developed that allows such violence in the first place is not only irresponsible, it's unproductive. Chanting slogans really isn't going to help fight terrorism, right? Though changing the way that we interact may, though. And another problem for me, and I'm not going to get too into this right now, but with the Charlie Hebdo response is that, of course, in the United States, having suffered the 9/11 attacks, we are already personally attached to acts of terrorism. At the same time, though, France is not here. what happened in that country happened within a specific context. And most Americans didn't know what Charlie Hebdo was before these attacks, and most Americans don't really know the history of the relationship between Muslims and the French government, Muslims and the French people, how that community lives together. So for us to even try to interact in what's going on with this connection, we're doing so very, very much uninformed, and it causes problems. All right. 3 very different Catholic responses emerged in the immediate aftermath of these attacks, and some of them were more effective than others. Father Martin is more effective, and we'll talk about him in a minute. But the first one that I want to talk about is Bill Donohue, the president of the Catholic League, released a statement that, while drawing attention to the context of the attacks, right, what I was just talking about, he essentially blamed the victim in his statement. And again, thinking about content and form, what he was saying might have been important. How he was saying it might have made it less important or made us not want to hear it as much. So he criticized the magazine's history of mocking all world religions, again, nobody is safe, and declared, quote, "Muslims are right to be angry," is what he said. His statement read that Charlie Hebdo editor, Stéphane Charbonnier, didn't understand the role he played in his tragic death, that he didn't understand the role that he played in his tragic death, and that had he not been so narcissistic, he may still be alive. Again, not the best way to make that criticism. He may be making a point that we should be talking about in the context of what was happening, maybe informing the general population of the history of the magazine, of this editor, that they might not know about, but still very insensitive, really harsh at that point. Charbonnier was notorious for being defiant in the face of criticism and threats. In 2012, when the magazine staff had received threats, he famously quoted, Zapata, and said, "What I'm about to say may sound a little pompous, but I'd rather die standing up than living on my knees." I mean, that was his always his attitude and his reaction to things. But at the same time, just because he had that kind of abrasive attitude doesn't make what Donohue said any less offensive or insensitive. He ended his statement by declaring, "Killing in response to insult, no matter how gross, must be univocally condemned. That is why what happened in Paris cannot be tolerated, but neither should we tolerate the kind of intolerance that provoked this violent reaction." So again, neither should we tolerate this kind of intolerance that provoked this violent reaction. And that was one of the things that gave me pause when all this was happening, to think, what is it that we're celebrating? Who are we aligning ourselves with my knowing the history of the magazine? So that's the first Catholic response. Second, Pope Francis. Pope Francis was more eloquent. Big surprise. He declared that it's an aberration to kill in the name of God or to justify violence with religion. He defended freedom of expression as a fundamental human right, but reminded listeners of the responsibility that comes with that right. He said, "You cannot provoke, you cannot insult the faith of others, you cannot make fun of the faith of others." And some people took offense to the Pope's statement where he said you cannot. They said that he should have said you should not, right? Because you can, by law, and this is where things get kind of tricky. By law, we can do and say whatever we want, freedom of speech, except for certain things like yelling fire in this room. You can't do that legally. But we want to protect the laws, right? We want to protect, by law, our right to freedoms of speech, freedom of expression. At the same time, socially, we want to build communities that will use those rights responsibly. Okay. Father James Martin, one of the more famous Jesuits. He is the chaplain, he was the chaplain of the Colbert Show. He was all over social media. He's all over all social media. You could follow him on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. He's all over the place. But he was posting that entire day in French, as in a move of solidarity, which I thought was was really classy move of solidarity. This is one of his posts that's on the screen, but one of his statements, one of the first statements that he posted in French read, "Let me tell you how disgusted I am with the murders in Paris today, and the way that, again, religion is used by fanatics as an excuse for murder. The Catholic Church, especially in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and in light of the Inquisition, does not have an excellent record on this. But today, one has to say firmly that God rejects violence on behalf of God." So again, with Father Martin's response is one that's more critically aware, it's better informed, it's taking into consideration his own context, right? As a Catholic priest, for him to condemn violence in the name of God, if he doesn't recognize how many acts the Catholic Church has taken, in terms of violence in the name of God, it kind of would diminish his message a little bit. He's owning up to his own history and calling into question what happened. And then again, he posted this prayer as well. What these three Catholic responses do, albeit in to different levels and different levels of success, really, is simultaneously reject violence as a means of persuasion, celebrate freedom as a human right, and highlight the responsibility to each other that comes with that freedom. The cartoon image, this one struck me as particularly problematic when it was released. Though it might have been meant to do that, as I was looking at it today, preparing for this, I was thinking maybe they meant to be problematic. When I saw this at first, when it first came out, you see Je Suis Charlie is the pen, and the gun is bigotry. And in my mind, that separates, the image means that Charlie Hebdo could not have been called a bigot. What they were doing in the magazine could not be called bigotry because of the way that this cartoon depicts the differences. And for me, again, that was problematic. It's one of those uncritical reflections of what's the response. And in no way draws attention to the accusations of bigotry hailed against the newspaper staff itself. And again, it's not self-reflective in the way that a lot of the Catholic responses that I just posted were. All right. There was some critical responses, and there was going on behind the Je Suis Charlie slogan movement. A parallel slogan took up some space on social media, one that heralded the heroism of the Muslim French police officer, Ahmed Marabat, the one who I spoke of before. Marabat was outside the Charlie Hebdo offices when the attacks occurred. He was injured in a shootout with a gunman, and then he was executed by one of them at point-blank range. The New York Times reported that some Twitter users wrote that Marabat had died defending a newspaper that was accused of insulting his faith, and one user posted a quotation attributed to French philosopher Voltaire, and that's the one that's posted there. I do not agree with what you have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Other commenters online echoed the Not in My Name social media campaign against the Islamic State. One mustn't forget that Muslims are the first victims of terrorism. That's what that says in French. Okay. And this cartoon also depicts that sentiment, that in attacking Charlie Hebdo, the gunman attacked Islam as well. Another user posted, "I am not Charlie. I am Ahmed, the dead cop. Charlie ridiculed my faith and culture, and I died defending his right to do so." So again, drawing attention to the tension in supporting Charlie Hebdo. Marabat's brother reminded us of the possible dangers of language acts and how language shapes our beliefs. At his brother's eulogy, he said, "One must not confuse extremists with Muslims. Madness has neither color nor religion. I want to make another point. Stop painting everybody with the same brush. Stop burning mosques or synagogues. You are attacking people. It won't bring back our dead, and it won't appease our families." And his choice of painting with the same brush really stuck with me because of the images in the cartoons, because of the act of the artistry that's associated with Charlie Hebdo. A second parallel social media campaign celebrated the heroism of Lassana Bathily, the Mali-born Muslim who saved 16 Jewish hostages by hiding them during the follow-up attack at a kosher deli. You might remember this. Well, Bathory became a symbol of hope, peace, and reconciliation after the attack. He resisted praise. People are calling me a hero, but I am not a hero. I am Lasana, and I will always be just myself. He said, yes, I helped Jews get out. We're brothers, Jewish or Christian or Muslims. We're all in the same boat. So again, he's identifying in a completely different way than what had been identified with before. Bathory said, my heart spoke and made me act. I didn't save Jews, I saved human beings. So how is he identifying in terms of Burke's theory? In terms of sameness, it's not the sameness of religion, but it's the sameness of being human. So again, going back to our questions. In the aftermath of violence, whether it's international terrorism or mass shootings here in the US, it makes sense that we would want to unite with others to both heal the wounds created by the violence itself and to foster security that may protect us from future violence. But we need to be reflexive about and critical of the ways that we attempt to unite. We can apply the same analytical tools of Burke and Eagleton that I just talked about in relation to Charlie Hebdo to other things that are going on, other tragedies. There was a social media campaign after Trayvon Martin was killed, where people were posting his picture as their profile picture on social media, or taking pictures of themselves with a hood so you can't see their face, in solidarity with his family. And that was both, problematic and productive as far as I'm concerned too, and we can talk about that if you're interested in a little bit. The Eric Gardner I Can't Breathe social media campaign, We Can't Breathe, a lot of people were taking it up as, that was his last, those were his last words. People were taking it up as their own identity, as their cultural identity, that the black community in our culture can't breathe, or that people outside of the black community in our culture can't breathe because of the ways that our ideals aren't being met by the way that the black community is being treated, was another aspect. The most recent one was two weeks ago. Does anybody remember Ahmed Mohammed, the 14-year-old kid in Texas who got detained for bringing the clock, yes, into school that he had built? A social media campaign that started in response to him, to his incident, was I stand with Ahmed. So it's not je suis, right? I'm not. It's not I am Ahmed, but I stand with Ahmed. And we could talk about possibly what the difference with that language is. Because aligning with and becoming are two different acts. So I figured we could spend time today talking about some of these things, about your own reaction to the theory that I was talking about, but also your reaction to the campaigns themselves, and possibly some others that you might have seen come up in response to other things, like I was saying in terms of the Trayvon Martin or any of the other stories that we've talked about in the past couple of years. Yes?
Where would you find the language or the skills to defend freedom of expression with people who have no sense of humor or humorless, and also they can't understand satire?
Yeah.
That's a big problem.
That is a problem. Satire is tricky, and this is something that I talk about with my students a lot of the times. You need to, going back to these questions, this is a rhetorical situation. You need to be very much aware of your audience when you're delivering these messages. If your audience isn't an audience that's going to understand the satire, either because they don't know the cultural references, or they don't have a sense of humor, or something like that, that's not the way you want to send that message to that audience. You have other options. Satire only works when it's done really well and with the right people. Jon Stewart is fantastic. I don't know what we're going to do without him, but not everybody can pull that off. And his message, for the most part, everybody got it, but there were audiences that he fell short with as well. So it's really a matter of looking at your rhetorical situation. Who is your audience, and what's the best way to send this message to them. So, and again, criticizing the Catholic Church for its policies, criticizing Islam for the way that people are practicing it, or criticizing the French, government in some way. These things aren't necessarily bad. It's a matter of how you do them and what the effects of your doing them are. And those are the kinds of things that you'd want to consider. Yes?
I don't think you should have to pan your audience to not be killed for something you say. I don't care what it is. I don't care how insulting or how stupid or how, uneducated or whatever. We all should be granted the right to life and be able to express ourselves. I mean,
at the bottom line, absolutely.
Whether or not people listen to us or not, whether they take us seriously or not, who cares? I mean, if you say something stupid, don't take me seriously. Kill me.
No, absolutely. But then, for me, the question then becomes, how did we as a culture develop to the point where somebody can be killed over something that they say? What has happened in our culture? What has happened in the way that we communicate with each other, that we interact with each other, that we live with each other, that would allow for this act, which should not happen? People should not be killed for things that they say. How does it happen? And how does it happen over and over and over again? Right? What's happened for us?
People have been killing each other for what they said for a long time. A good long time. Not as long as, I mean, people would have duels because someone is. I mean, we take people's words or cartoons or what they say about us very, very personally.
Right.
It can. And I'm not defending the terrorists. I'm just saying that this is part of human nature, that we often respond in a very reactionary and violent way when we're offended.
Right. And if you think about what I was saying before in terms of Kenneth Burke and what he believes is the purpose of communication, the purpose of the study of rhetoric, if it really is to make connections with other human beings, doing so in a way that makes the other human being want to kill you, you're not doing it right. You know what I mean?
The difference is that it's instantaneous now, where I didn't know what anyone said before. It was just my social group. We knew each other. We spoke the truth that we saw, and they either accepted it and were our friends, or they said, I'm getting another group. But now it's instant twittering and blogging and all this, and it's too much, and we don't see the faces of the people that are saying it. So obviously anger builds up.
Right. And
We didn't know about
the explosion of connection, right? The fact that we have social media and that we have the internet and that we have this opportunity to interact with millions of people, however many million tweets in the first 24 hours, opens up a lot of opportunity for dialogue, right? And for connection. But it also creates a lot of opportunity for miscommunication or for hurtful speech and things like that. And part of it, for me anyway, because this is what I teach, I feel like it's my job to prepare our students to participate in those environments in ways that'll be much more productive than the ways that a lot of people are using them now. Sandra?
I think, I found it difficult to say Je suis Charlie because of what you bring up about satire. Satire is fine among people
who have the privilege of,
and have the privilege to have it, and yet you say, on the other hand, you say I can't breathe with the guy who couldn't breathe, or Black Lives Matter. There are ways of attacking things without really, kind of putting another knife into the displaced Muslim.
Yep, absolutely. And that was one of the things for me too. That was, if you all noticed, and I don't know if anybody noticed while I was doing this, I did not have not one of the covers of Charlie Hebdo in this presentation. And that was purposeful. I did not distribute any of the covers on social media when the attacks happened. A lot of people were posting the covers in solidarity again and almost in defiance of, you can't kill me for, you know, for a picture. I refused. I would not put it on any of my accounts because, one, I didn't want to perpetrate that hurtfulness or putting the knife in any further to anyone who that would be offensive to in general, and also because I have lots of Muslim friends who I care about who are connected to my social media accounts, and I wouldn't want to do that to them. Yes.
And that's exactly why I disagree with your presentation and the moral choice.
Okay.
Okay? So, number one, if you're a Muslim, you do not have to, you should never depict the Prophet, but there's a fundamental right not to be a Muslim. And if you're not a Muslim, you might actually disagree with Islam, and you have to be free to say that in emphatic ways. You are free to depict the Prophet as you like, precisely because you are free to be a Muslim or not to be a Muslim. And people who are Muslims who do not understand the difference, they've actually, in my view, respectfully misunderstood even Islam. The prohibition is not actually of non-depiction, which is actually itself an interpretation, should apply to people who are outside that. It's only within that. And it is our fun. It is insulting and inaccurate to merely describe this as satire. This is not a point about mocking. It's a point about basic freedom, that we are free to be Muslims or to not, and we express that freedom in part by depicting the Prophet, precisely because we are free to do that. And you didn't have any of those depictions.
No.
And the rest of us cannot understand actually the context of these murderous attacks without even seeing, frankly, how benign the covers were that generated this murderous assault. And I stand with Ezra Klein and serious journalists who, of course, made it a point the day after the murders to republish these covers that they didn't publish before, but that have to be published now as news context, so for us to understand just actually what it was that provoked these madmen and tyrants to do what they did, which is actually saying the rest of us can't be free to think as we like, and to speak as we like. So, and there were lots of outlets that chose, even after this, not to depict the cover, and I disagree with them, and I disagree with your moral choices not to do that. I stand, hold on, with Ezra Klein. Now, there's only one reason, actually, that I can think of why one would do this. That's actually morally serious and morally defensible. Because I was actually on the board of Yale University Press, which had a choice about publishing these Danish pictures, because we had this before, and there was a whole book, and were we going to reprint these Danish cartoons? And the reason at the end of the day, and there's still some ambiguity about whether the author decided not to reprint the cartoons or Yale Press pressured the author into doing that. I mean, I can't even remember what my position was at the time on this. But I can understand why one might not reprint it for a very simple reason. It's about a cowardice. Because when one does not want to become a target oneself, just like one might want to out oneself as gay in 1966, when that could generate reprisals, and it's precisely when at Stonewall that people say we're all going to stand up together because this is wrong, that we should not be able to actually express our views. And so I will come out, if you will come out, we'll all come out together, we will stand for freedom. So I understand when Yale Press was maybe alone in publishing those cartoons, frankly, we might have been afraid that we as a campus would have been targeted, a subject of terrorism, of murderous terrorist attack, and we can't actually, defend all students on our campus or around the world. And so I understand, and prudence is important. There's I get it. But today, no, I think part of saying I'm Charlie is to stand up for this idea that actually, If you're a Muslim, fine, don't depict the Prophet. That's your choice. But the rest of us have a freedom not to be Muslims and actually absolutely to depict. There's nothing,
Yes.
this is not just satire. This is a fundamental point about freedom of religion and of speech and freedom from religion too, from religious fanaticism and tyranny and intolerance. So I'm not sure, I think that's merely je suis bigotry or something, je suis Charlie, but je suis tyrannie. Okay, when you actually don't understand where your rights end and other people's rights begin, you're a tyrant.
That makes sense. But again, I mean, we have the freedom to not be Muslim. We have the freedom to make choices as to how we want to express ourselves in solidarity with Charlie Hebdo and what happened with the French people, with other people who are who have suffered in the hands of tyrants. You know, the tyrants that you're speaking of.
But how can we understand any of that context in a serious academic presentation at a university when you don't even give us the picture so that we can actually, and when you see them, you think, Mike, because I've seen them, and I'm glad that I've seen them, because actually I now know that in fact, I do not want to blame Charlie Hebdo and blame the victim for what they did, because those depictions are pretty darn tame.
Well, one of the reasons for my choices is that, I'm sorry?
Absolutely.
Innocuous.
And merely call them satire, because they're, and lots of other things they do, they're actually, Charlie, immature and
Yeah.
but not right, but not in this. This is actually genuinely morally serious, and I think we were entitled to see it.
Okay. Before I explain my choice, let somebody else speak.
Defend my colleague.
So, and by the way, that was a rhetorical performance. That's what persuasion is. Not just talking about it, but doing it. Okay, and rallying people on behalf of what we believe, which is freedom. It's not just about satire, it's about freedom.
SP.
And that was rhetoric. I did this on purpose in a rhetorical way, because actually that's, but you as an academic should have at least told us, honestly, why you chose not to have any of those depictions.
I will explain why I don't have any of them in more detail, but.
I think Teresa has a purpose for this presentation. You know, she used a setting which people feel very strongly about, and I think that part of, I'm putting words in her mouth now. It was
I'll let you know if you're right or wrong.
I don't think it was her intention to debate whether what happened was right or wrong or whatever.
Exactly.
It was succinctly summed up in what she said a few minutes back. She said that you have an option using a set of tools, which is rhetoric and prosody. That's how it's always in my mind. That's how my teacher taught it. You use that essentially for persuasive communication.
Yes.
You know, all that other stuff, you know, notwithstanding, which I also didn't follow, the basic aspect of this is persuasion. And again, should you use certain persuasive techniques indiscriminately, or would you consider the consequences? And I think that that's the thrust of her presentation. And I would say, always, that's my part at the university as a teacher, as a lifelong learner, that to make the link between what your actions and the consequences. If you trust that link, then say, I know.
Do we go until 4:30? 4:30. Is that when? Yeah. Okay.
Very well presented. I don't think she needed to put in the pictures. You can look at them. I was looking at them. And sure, it's not.
That was,
out of line.
no, thank you, SP. That did explain part of why I chose not to show them, is that I figured, one, everybody would have seen, well, not everybody, but a lot of people would have seen them already, one, and two, they are easily accessible in other places. But I want other people to respond to before I...
But getting back to the cartoons themselves and being published in Charlie Hebdo, you had to pay money to get that magazine. And you weren't forced to. It wasn't on television. The people who subscribed to it, made a personal decision that they wanted that copy of the magazine. Nobody forced it down anybody's throat. and not an awful lot of people subscribe to it. So why should we get concerned about it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of the concern is that people are being killed, right, for things. I mean, that is a reaction, not just in terms of, journalism, but just in general. You know, we are a violent culture. We are killing people for differences of opinion, differences of belief, differences of the way that we live. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I would be concerned about it anyway.
But if we just are lily-livered about it, then we're going to have a pretty awful civilization.
How?
What I heard was, in part, what you're saying about rhetoric is that to be more persuasive, it involves certain simplification. You choose to emphasize certain things, and you choose to de-emphasize other things. And I'd like to point out that the professor's defense of freedom did precisely the same thing. And in that sense, he was being rhetorical. Because the idea that one expresses one's freedom in such a way that one can simply choose or not choose a character that has been developed over time in one's life is a vast oversimplification that requires, for example, a very sophisticated education that a lot of people simply don't get. So even in this group, there's a lot of people who are Catholic, there's a lot of people who are Jewish. Ask yourself in that context, to what extent are you free to step away from that life that you have developed? In which case, that the waving the banner of freedom is a simplification of an issue that, in simplifying it, it hides, I think, the difference between satire and contempt. Contempt matters in personal relations and in social relations.
Thanks, Hal. You had your hand up for a while.
I was just going to say that, in a sense, your presentation, it reminds me of what happens when you frame an issue. I mean, framing, again, to pick up on what our colleagues said, you highlight certain things and you omit others. So even around 9/11, I mean, there was a political psychology of competing narratives that Mark Howard Ross analyzed, because there were different narratives around 9/11, and depending on what you chose to emphasize, your frame was adjusted. Now, in something like this, I mean, I would be inclined to agree with my friend Akil there that I would want to see the whole. I would want to see the whole presentation. And I would want to see it because I would want the context first and foremost, and second, because then I again, it comes back to freedom. I would want to have the freedom in the context of seeing it all, to evaluate and to assess what's underlying what happened. And I don't feel that without that context, I really have the freedom of choice to do that.
Okay. Again, going back to what SP said in his explaining what I was thinking and doing, and you hit it. I mean, you hit part of it, right? Really, really well. For me, part of this presentation wasn't so much defending Charlie Hebdo or freedom of speech, or calling into question whether or not people should be killed for things that they said, or calling into question, how do we react? How do we deal with terrorism in a certain way? It was much more about the question of our joining these solidarity movements in a way that is possibly uncritical, in a way that is possibly unrhetorical, in a way that we're uninformed, and because there's 5 million tweets in 24 hours, something that's easy to either jump on or turn off of without really thinking about what it is we're doing, especially since so much of what happens in the world happens in a context that we in the United States don't understand fully anyway. So that was one of the reasons for the choices. I have a bunch of others too, but.
I've never seen the pictures, so I would.
You can Google them.
I'm not a Google guy. When Google became a verb, I had a problem. But in a hypothetical way, if if a magazine shows the Pope having sex with a young boy.
Which I think Charlie Hebdo may have, now that you just mentioned that. It's possible.
I wonder how many tweets, and let's say somebody got killed for that. Would there have been as many tweets?
I don't know. It's possible. I mean, again, nobody's really safe with Charlie Hebdo in the history of the magazine. You know, it was an equally.
They would have that as the target. I'm just saying.
Would the reaction be the same?
Would have exploded. Would people have been as willing to say, "I am Charlie"? I understand the reason.
I think, I mean,
because no matter what you do, you shouldn't get killed for it.
Right, and I think that was the, you know, the act in and of itself would be the same thing. So quite possibly, but we don't, you know, we don't know what would have happened. Just, and then
we cannot rationalize fundamentalism.
Way around.
But okay.
It's not just that you didn't show Charlie Hebdo's cartoons. You did not show some of the most famous cartoons that arose in the aftermath, several of which won prizes, depicted the prophet with the words, "because I can." And that wasn't the immaturity of Charlie Hebdo. They were making this was not satire. It was a fundamental political point. And twice you said something that I do disagree with, and maybe I disagree with Burke. You said, you know, it's our culture and ours is. No, our culture did not kill these people. A different culture that stands, frankly, and this Burke doesn't want me to talk about it maybe, or he wants to bring it to the surface, but there is fundamentally a culture that believes in free speech and the right of others to disagree, and a tyrannical, murderous culture that insists not only that its adherents not depict the prophet, fine, they're entitled to within their faith tradition, but also is trying to impose that on non-adherents, and that is the fundamental wrong of their position, that we have to be free. They're free to be Muslims of a certain sort, and other people are free to be Muslims of a different sort, because there's a debate in Islam, and others are free to be non-Muslims of various sorts, and we must be free to say what we think, to have depictions or not. You have, and all these were captured by the pen. Being ultimately mightier than a sword that tries to shut down discourse. But what some of those pens and some of the famous cartoons after Charlie Hebdo doing were depicting the prophet.
And I chose not to show them as well.
I chose not to show those, and those are some of the most famous ones. And one of them was, I believe, won a prize that then in turn was at the heart of a murderous assault here in America in Texas.
Yes, and that was
by
that was
someone who I personally find quite distasteful in all sorts of ways, and I believe this is also a person who is demagoguing in ways that I find repulsive about the Ground Zero Mosque and other things. But depicting the prophet, I think, has to be. You know, there's a fundamental moral choice about whether we're going to actually ever do it because we can.
Okay, one more comment and then I'll respond. And
Good points are being made. However, I think she's being asked to give a different presentation than the one she chose to give. She gave her purpose, and she presented her purpose. And Charlie Hebdo was an example. She did not have to show that to be able to say, "This is what I'm talking about."
yeah, thank you. But I want to just respond one more, and then we've got to break for the reception. But in response to the idea of like our culture and no, this is somebody else's culture, this is part of something different, and you're saying that maybe you disagree with Burke, and in you know simplifying Burke to try to present it here today, that would be a disagreement. But that's also, we do disagree on that as well, you and I personally, and that part of my studying rhetoric, part of my choosing Burke, and part of this presentation is my belief that we are all connected and we are all responsible to each other and we are all responsible to the world that we're living in. That we have created, I believe, people like terrorists in one way or another, and that we need to be responsible to each other in understanding that. All right, thank you.
Thank you. What better way to end today than with a dispute? We have to come back together again. We won't all agree with everything, but this is the kind of discussion that needs to be had. And thank you for coming. Please do your evaluations, and please come and have a drink with us outside. Thank you.